Well, thank you very, very much, Susana, Nick, Maria. It's really great to have the opportunity to be on the stage for this unusual transatlantic conference at a time which is also very unusual. It's a time when we've been hit very hard by an external force that has obliged us to look at what wasn't working in our world before, but more importantly, how can we use this terrible event that is COVID to rebuild our world, to address the fractures that predate COVID, and to do this in a cooperative manner. Obviously, in this cooperative endeavor, the transatlantic relation is essential. I have for many, many years worked very hard, but also very enthusiastically with very different EU administrations, with very different US administrations. But if there is one thing I have learned in this many years is that today this transatlantic relation lacks a bit of heart. The heart is not beating, or at least is not beating as strongly as it should, in order for the transatlantic relation to be a force for good. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is give you a bit of a sense of the fractures that predate COVID, that are part of the world we live in, how COVID has changed the landscape, how we're trying to address it in Europe, and then to look at what the European Union, Europe, and the United States could do together to reshape this new world. Let me start with the fractures that were very present in our world before COVID. We were seeing a very serious climate fracture with climate change threatening future generations and threatening and affecting most sharply countries that are weaker. We were seeing a socio-economic fracture with winners taking a lot and losers being a big part of our economies, with inequalities growing. We were seeing a fracture in technology, in access to the means or the big driver of globalization in the 21st century, which is technology. And more importantly, we were seeing a questioning of liberal democracies, which is the bedrock on which this transatlantic relationship is built. It's a questioning by many people of this liberal democracy, questioning of governments, questioning of institutions that puts at risk the system of values in which we have built, again, our transatlantic relationship. And then COVID hit us and brought a new dimension to our interdependence and obliged us to look at what wasn't working and what wasn't functioning in our system of global governance, the system of governance that we had given ourselves to manage our interdependence. I always insist that we are not living in a world of independence. We are living in a world where the norm is interdependence. And therefore, the big question in front of us is, how do we manage this interdependence? How do we become more sovereign by sharing more our national sovereignty? Sometimes this looks like a bit of a contradiction, but I think it bears repeating because the sense that I have seen and judged by what I've seen in these last years is that we took the wrong turn, that we thought that in order to govern better and manage better our interdependence, we had to become more nationally sovereign. And thus is not delivering the kind of responses that our citizens wanted us to deliver. So what can we do? We think, seen from Spain, that we have to invest in three broad areas. First, we have to staunchly defend democracy, human rights, and values that at the end of the day are the bedrock of our societies. And we in Spain know very well what the absence of democracy means, which gives us another reason why we want to fight for democracy in Spain, in Europe, but also around the world. Number two, we have to show our commitment to a global, integrated, but also more equitable, fairer, more sustainable economy. Number three, we think that we have to support greater regional integration, regional governance, but also greater investments at multilateral governance. This is what we've been doing in Europe, and this is what COVID has accelerated. COVID brought a bit of a cacophony to Europe at the beginning of this pandemic. We thought that this was a health crisis, and health is a national competence. But we very quickly realized that the pandemic was questioning three major ingredients of our European project. It was threatening the free movement of goods. At the beginning of the crisis, countries started hoarding products. A bit like what we're seeing today with some other countries trying to hoard medicines. We quickly realized this was not going to work, that we had to go back to ensuring a possibility for goods to circulate freely within the EU. Number two, we quickly realized that the pandemic was questioning free movement of people, Schengen Agreement. This incredible force for getting people in Europe closer to each other, but also for ensuring the connection of Europe to the rest of the world. And we only now have realized what erecting borders again means for this free circulation. The third thing we learned is that there was a threat to the internal market, this common market, this common economy that represents the internal market. This is why what we've tried to do all through this past 3 months is work on providing responses. Responses to the health crisis by getting Europeans better prepared, preparedness, resilience, an item that will remain very high on our agenda. We used to think that resilience was only about the financial sector and maybe a bit on the security and defense side. We've now realized that resilience has to be the norm in our economies. Getting better prepared to face extreme events, whether they are on the health, whether they are on the climate, or any other type, needs to be the norm. We've also been working to restore the European economy. We are working hard to build a recovery package that represents solidarity of all European members for all European citizens, to boost the European economy, to reboot the European economy by rebooting the internal market as a means to ensure we leave no European citizen behind. Some people have called this solidarity exercise in the European Union a Hamiltonian moment. I rather like to speak about Rousseau moment, not only because I've lived for many years in Geneva, which is the home of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, but also because what we've learned through the crisis is that what we need to reinvent is a new social compact. To ensure that fractures in our society are cured, leaving no citizen behind. For us, COVID in Europe has meant building a little bit more of a strategic autonomy. It is not about isolating ourselves from the world. It means building a more confident Europe to be a more confident actor in a world that has become more geopolitically fractured. Obviously, as we rebuild the European economy, as we build a new social compact in Europe, we want and we need to do this with our transatlantic vocation in mind. We need to do this in a manner that brings Europe and America closer together. And we need to do this because the COVID has told us that the interdependence in our world has become even more exacerbated with COVID. Some people talk about deglobalization. I think what I see when I look at the world is not a world that is deglobalizing. It's a world that is re-globalizing. It's been more interconnected, but the driver of this interconnection is today the digital economy, is today technology. But the problem is we do not have a system of governance for this more re-globalized world. A digitally powered world is less well governed, with an absence of global rules that will pose problems for this new compact that we want to build, in which we live no longer. This is where I want to put the cursor in this transatlantic relations. We need to rebuild, and I agree very much with Nick's opening remarks. We need to rebuild the heart of this transatlantic relation, to start building the rules that will help us govern our interdependence. We need to govern better climate change and the challenges that it poses to our economies and to our societies. We need to work better together to manage migrations. It's not just with a national view that we can do it. We need to do this with an international view, with solidarity at the heart of it. We need to redefine the global economy. And for all of this and much more is where we need, again, this transatlantic partnership. The partnership should focus on three areas. Number one, we need the partnership between Europe and America to help us exit the crisis. We need to dial down on the conflicts that we have on the trade, investment, and economic fields. What we need to do now is work together to reduce tensions, because tensions increase volatility, and volatility is exactly the enemy of a recovery that we need to work on to boost together. For the benefit of the citizens in Europe and in America, but also for the benefit of citizens around the world. The two large economies in the world that are the US and the EU need to find a way to address the difficulties and the differences we have on the trade side, and we read this on the newspapers every day, on the technology front, on the taxation front, and we need to do this again because we need to be responsible to reboot the economy for ourselves, but also for the rest of the world. And here I'm thinking of many economies in Latin America, in Africa, in America, in Asia that are suffering the impact of the COVID pandemic and have less fiscal space and less means to confront the recovery. Second, we need obviously to deal with a number of pre-existing conflicts that have only aggravated with COVID, whether it's Syria, whether it's Libya, whether it's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the Middle East, whether it's violation of human rights, but also whether it's addressing inequalities within our own economies, or whether it's collaborating Europe and America with the Latin American economies, not on the Latin American economies, and not competing against each other for influence in Latin America, but working together, Latin America, United States, and Europe, to boost our relation, to maximize the complementarities that we have, and to help each other manage difficulties that we also have, from inequalities to violations of human rights, to digitalization, to gender equality, and so on. Three, and I want to insist on this third part, that we need to be able to reboot multilateralism. We need to build a system of governance for this new globalized world, whether it's on things like digital taxation, whether it's on things like data protection, whether it's on things like labor rights in this more digitally powered economy, whether it's on cybersecurity. We need to do this. First and foremost, because if we don't do it, we are going to have difficulties of legitimacy with our voters. They feel dispossessed. They feel that their governments are not capable of answering many of the questions they have. And to be quite honest with you, I don't think many of these questions can be answered purely at the national level. They need to be answered at the supranational level. And that's where, again, the transatlantic relation is so important. We build the system of governance we live in today together. After the Second World War, we now have another opportunity to build a system of governance for this re-globalized world. Let me end by telling you that I have lots of expectations to rebuild this transatlantic trust, to give it a bit of heart. The heart used to be, at one point, fighting against totalitarianism. The fight was then to spread democracy. The fight was thereafter to impulse globalization. I think the fire in this transatlantic relationship now has to be our common project, has to be to rehumanize globalization, to make it work for all our citizens, to use the parlance of the United Nations. So thank you very much for having given me the opportunity to share these very brief moments with you. And let me end by saying I very much look forward to continuing this conversation in person as soon as COVID allows us to do that. Thanks again. And floor back to you, Susanna Nick.
Well, Minister, thank you. I think we're waiting for Susanna to appear alongside me for this conversation, but I think we had agreed that I would ask you the first question, so I will ask you the first question. Let me thank you for your remarks. Delivered, by the way, in absolutely flawless English, and I must excuse the lack of flawless Spanish from my part. I apologize for that. I think you've given us hope. You've certainly given me hope in the way that you've framed these three challenges, and I agree with you on all of them. We've got to be working together on COVID-19 and the global economy. We have to work together on the pre-existing disagreements like Israel-Palestine, and let's hope there is no announcement on annexation this week or next out of the Israeli government. And we have to build a system of governance. So I agree with you on everything. I wanted to ask you a question about an issue that we haven't had time for yet. That's China. Both of us, Europe and the United States, Spain and the United States, we want a productive relationship with China. We want to engage and trade with China. We want peace with China. And yet, I think it's been difficult to build a European-American consensus on how to approach China. It seems to me that we have the same problems on trade, and that with China, if the EU and US would combine forces in the WTO to remind China of its obligations, that would be a powerful thing to do. We don't always speak with the same voice or the same decibel level, if you will, on human rights, where you've seen, and I credit the Trump administration, I support what the Trump administration has done in speaking out against the violation of the democratic rights of the people of Hong Kong, against what's happening to the Uyghur population in Xinjiang province, and certainly against Chinese aggression towards India and towards its neighbors in the South China Sea. So we seem to have a different way of looking at that, Europe and the United States. And we have a difference on Huawei and 5G. And my question to you is, will there be a common European position that might emerge on China that would work well either with President Trump in his second term if he's elected, or with Vice President Biden if he's elected?
Thank you, Nick. And it's true that this is a question that consumes many people on both sides of the Atlantic. I'd like to define a relationship with China using three words. One is strategic, 2 is systemic, and 3 is rival. Let me briefly explain what they mean to me. When we speak of strategic, it means that we need to invest in a relationship with China like China invests in a relationship with us, with a long-term view, with a long-term perspective, with identifying what are the long-term forces, not just what are the short-term political imperatives. This is how they look at us, and this is how they relate to Europe or to America. We need to be able to take this longer-term view and build strategic engagement with China and relations with China that builds this longer-term ingredient into it. Because if not, we are caught in our shorter-term political cycles, sometimes not even a legislature. Second is systemic. Systemic to me speaks of issues where we have to be able to engage positively with China, because without China's participation, we cannot address some of these systemic issues. We will not be able to decarbonize our economies if we do not engage China into this effort. We will not be able to preserve biodiversity if we do not engage China into this effort. We will not be able to ensure the stability of the world financial system if we do not engage China in this conversation. So there are many areas where we need to have a positive agenda, and we have to define this openly. We've got to define this clearly through dialogue, which is how you define a positive agenda. And then we have the third word that is difficult. It's called rivalry, and it speaks of areas where we compete. And not only do we compete on economic terms, we also compete on values. And on visions of society. And on this one, I think, at least from where I sit, it would be very important to ensure a level playing field, whether it's on the economic side or whether it's on the value side. And for this, again, my very modest experience in international life has told me that this be better done through engagement, through checks and balances, through systems, through rules, through adjudication mechanisms, through means that reduce the ability of countries to behave in a unilateral manner. And this speaks of governance, and this governance today is supranational and requires an engagement. This is how I view the agenda ahead of us, Nick, as regards China, the US, and the European Union. And the problem we have is that we cannot just simply take one of the words and develop and act on one of these three words. We need a combination of the three.
Thank you very, very much. I think Susanna is going to appear momentarily to ask you a second question, if I'm not mistaken. Let's hope.
That is exactly how it was planned, Nick, and it's working. So technology is working and is helping us be connected. Minister, you introduced some very interesting words. You talk about reglobalization, which is a bit against what we hear these days, and it means a lot. It means not only a new way of globalizing, it also means that that nationalism, building barriers, is not the way to go. And the 21st century challenges that you mentioned are all essentially all global. You spoke about a new social compact and the need to have the peoples at the center and to really think about a new human perspective to the economy and to what we do when we rebuild what we have to rebuild. And you spoke about values and trust. And I have a question coming from the audience, which comes very pertinent to what you laid out as the ground rules. And the question says, to what extent are the current institutional arrangements in need of reform vis-a-vis all this new landscape? And also, to what extent are barriers to cooperation due to political leaders, not so much due to institutions?
This is it's a question that is very close to my heart. Why do I say this? Because I have lived in a number of these institutions in the past. I've lived in a European institution called European Commission. I've lived in a multilateral institution called World Trade Organization. I've lived, like you, Susanna, in another one called United Nations. And what I have learned is that institutions are very much the sum of the investment that the shareholders want to put in these institutions. If the shareholders put a lot of means, political attention, financial attention, if they put a lot, they get a lot. And they get a lot because in this re-globalized world, we have seen why a purely national response will not be enough to protect our citizens. Citizens want protection everywhere around the world. The big question out there is, what's the best means to protect citizens? So in my experience, and it's becoming more and more so the case, a big part of this protection will come from international cooperation. And international cooperation is not international organizations. That's the place. International cooperation will come from the investments that governments will put in this international organization. We are living through an incredible moment in Europe because we are today deciding whether or not we make a huge investment in these European institutions to protect our citizens. And I think we are understanding that today, for the European institutions to help protect the European citizens, there has to be a big investment by the stakeholders. But at the same time, if I change from Brussels to Geneva, I move to the World Trade Organization, we are seeing very little investment from some of the major shareholders of this organization. As a result of which, the organization cannot protect traders as much as it could and it should if the shareholders were ready to invest in these organizations. So this is why I think what we need to understand today is protecting today means investing more in multilateral regional governance systems. You give a bit of sovereignty and you gain incredible sovereignty in protecting your citizens. Some of these organizations need serious reforms. Some issues don't have international organizations to deal with, to deliver and develop the governance. That's the challenge we have ahead of us, and this is where the transatlantic partnership and cooperation will be essential to protect our citizens. This is where we have a big investment to make.
Minister, we're hitting pretty much the end of the time that we have asked you and you so generously gave us, but maybe as a last question also coming from the audience and related to the need to have this strength in the transatlantic partnership, how do you rebuild the trust that you made reference to between the two sides of this, I would say, North Atlantic part of the transatlantic, because you then need to bring the rest, coming from the rest, but at least to build that trust between the two key players in this transatlantic relationship. How do you go about that?
I think it's not enough to say that you trust. I think you need to do in order to demonstrate that you trust. So we have ahead of us the incredible challenge of demonstrating in concrete terms. It need not be big, it can start small, but demonstrate with action, with clear steps to be taken, to demonstrate that we start rebuilding the trust that we lack today. And we have ample points on our common agenda, whether it's again on the trade side, whether it's on the digital side, whether it's on the foreign policy, whether it's on NATO and defense and security, whether it's on commitment to work to bring stability to other parts of the world. Trust needs to be incarnated in concrete and concrete steps. That's done in the next few months.
Minister González, I think we have really appreciated your time and dedication, your message, which is a perfect way to lead into the next panel we are having. So feel free to stay, but I know that you have plenty of things on your agenda. We thank you again, and with this, we let you go, and Nick will be coming back to introduce the panel. Thanks again, Madam Minister.
Thank you so much. Thank you, team.
Bye.